April 12, 1945. While the world mourned the death of President Franklin Roosevelt, in the dark waters off Okinawa, 84 American sailors were about to become the first victims of a weapon so terrible that the Japanese themselves would try to forget it forever. In just 3 minutes, the destroyer USS Mannert L Abele would be split in two by something the Americans didn't even know existed: a manned flying bomb. A flesh-and-blood missile traveling at over 1,000 kilometers per hour. The first human-guided cruise missile in history. The sailors of the Abele were on a suicide mission without even knowing it. They were a radar picket ship positioned 120 kilometers off the coast of Okinawa, serving as advanced sentinels for the American fleet. Their task was simple but deadly. Detect approaching Japanese planes and sound the alarm before they reach the main ships. They were the eyes of the fleet, and also the most obvious target. On that April day, the Abele's radar began to flash. Enemy planes approaching. The crew rushed to their combat stations. The anti-aircraft guns began to roar. One kamikaze after another fell from the sky under intense American artillery fire. The sailors were doing well, until something different appeared. Captain James Stewart of a nearby vessel saw it with his own eyes and could hardly believe what he was witnessing. Two planes orbiting north of the Abele. Suddenly, something broke away from one of them and accelerated in a way that defied everything he knew about aviation. Incomprehensible speed. A 30-degree dive angle. Coming from 7 kilometers away. The gunners of the Abele didn't even have time to turn their guns. The flying object struck the ship at the waterline like a hammer from God. The explosion was so violent that the ship's keel simply broke. Bow and stern bent upward simultaneously as if the Abele were made of cardboard. The ship literally broke in half. Minutes earlier, a conventional kamikaze attack had already penetrated the aft engine room, but the ship was holding out. Now, with the second impact, there was no hope. In less than 3 minutes after the mysterious weapons attack, the USS Mannert L Abele was at the bottom of the ocean at a depth of 1,380 meters. 84 men died. The survivors were rescued without knowing exactly what had hit them. American naval intelligence began a frantic investigation. What the hell was that thing? The answer was terrifying. The Japanese had created the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka. In Japanese, Oka means cherry blossom, a symbol of ephemeral beauty and honorable death. The Americans had another name for it, Baka, idiot, because only an idiot would voluntarily enter that death machine. The Oka was essentially a manned flying bomb, an aluminum cylinder with wooden wings, no landing gear, carrying 1,200 kilograms of explosives in its nose. The pilot was locked inside from the outside. There was no way out. It was specifically designed for a one-way mission only. But what made the Oka truly terrifying was its speed. 3 solid-fuel rockets in the rear could propel it to 650 kilometers per hour in level flight. In a dive, it reached over 1,000 kilometers per hour. It was the fastest plane in the world at that time. Too fast to be intercepted by fighters. Too fast to be hit by anti-aircraft fire. Too small to be easily detected. Too deadly to be ignored. The philosophy behind the Oka was frighteningly simple. The Japanese were losing the war. Their experienced pilots were dead. Their quality planes were destroyed. Their conventional tactics no longer worked against overwhelming American superiority. So, a young naval officer named Mitsuo Oda had a macabre idea. If inexperienced pilots couldn't hit ships with conventional bombs, why not turn the pilot himself into the bomb? The Oka would be carried by a Betty bomber to near the targets. When released, the pilot would glide towards the American ships. Then, at a deadly distance, he would fire the rockets and transform into a supersonic missile guided by human intelligence. There was no electronic guidance system in the world in 1945 that could match the precision of a human being determined to die. The Oka's first operational mission was a complete disaster. In March 1945, 16 Betty bombers carrying Okas attempted to attack the American fleet. American fighters intercepted them before they even got close to the targets. All 16 bombers were shot down. Not a single Oka was launched. The problem was obvious. The slow, heavy Betty bombers carrying the Okas were far too easy targets, but the Japanese persisted. They refined their tactics. They waited for favorable weather conditions. They used diversions and coordinated attacks. And on April 12, 1945, it finally worked. The USS Mannert L Abele became the first confirmed victim of the Oka. It wouldn't be the last. Throughout the Okinawa campaign, 7 American ships were damaged or sunk by Oka attacks. But here's what makes this story even more sinister. On the same day the Abele was sunk, the Allied news blockade on kamikaze attacks was lifted. For months, Admiral Chester Nimitz had ordered total censorship of information about Japanese suicide attacks. The High Command didn't want the American public to know how desperate and effective this new Japanese tactic was. The truth could shatter the nation's morale. But when Roosevelt died, the censorship was lifted. The irony is cruel. The first successful Oka attack happened on the very day that Americans could finally talk about the kamikaze threat. But the story doesn't end there. After the war, something strange happened. The Japanese began systematically erasing the memory of the Oka and kamikaze tactics from their historical records. It was too shameful, too barbaric, too desperate. Post-war Japan wanted to rebuild itself as a peaceful and modern nation. The Oka represented everything they wanted to forget about their fanatical militaristic past. The stories of the Oka pilots were suppressed. Their names were rarely mentioned. Veterans who survived aborted missions were instructed to remain silent. It was as if 1,000 young Japanese men, members of the Junrai Butai Thunder God Corps, had never existed. As if 852 Okas had never been built. As if this terrifying weapon was merely a feverish nightmare of war. But the wreckage doesn't lie. In 2023, 78 years later, ocean explorers found the USS Mannert L Abele on the seabed. The ship is exactly as witnesses described. Broken in two. Bow and stern bent upwards. The keel destroyed by the explosive force that no conventional weapon of that time could produce. The 84 sailors are still there, in their steel tomb 4,500 meters deep. Frozen forever at the moment they were struck by the secret weapon that Japan tried to erase from history. The Oka represented the most disturbing aspect of war. The transformation of human beings into disposable weapons. The industrialization of suicide. The marriage between advanced technology and ancient fanaticism. Today, when we see kamikaze drones in Ukraine or cruise missiles in modern conflicts, we are seeing the conceptual descendants of the Oka. The difference is that now the pilot is miles away, safe, controlling the weapon by video. In 1945, the pilot was inside the bomb. It was the bomb. And this truth was so horrific that both victors and losers tacitly agreed not to talk much about it. The Americans censored it out of fear of public morals. The Japanese suppressed it out of national shame. And so, the Oka almost disappeared from history. But the USS Mannert L Abele remains at the bottom of the ocean as a silent witness. An underwater monument to the day when such a terrible weapon was used that both sides of the war preferred to pretend it never existed. 3 minutes. That's all it took. 3 minutes for a modern warship to be destroyed by a technology so advanced and so primitive at the same time. So effective and so desperate. So innovative and so horrific that even its creators wanted to erase it from humanity's collective memory. But the story of the men inside those machines is even more disturbing than the weapon itself. They weren't crazy fanatics. They were educated young men, talented pilots, men with dreams and families, and they volunteered for it. In August 1944, posters appeared at Japanese air bases asking for volunteers for special attack missions. The suicidal nature of the mission was not hidden. Still, hundreds of men came forward. When they eliminated the married men, the only children, the elderly, and those with heavy family responsibilities, 600 volunteers still remained. On October 1, 1944, even before the formation of the first conventional kamikaze squadrons, the 721st Naval Air Corps was born. Its unofficial nickname was Jinrai Butai, Divine Thunder Corps. The commander was Captain Motoharu Okamura, a veteran who had vowed to turn the tide of the war with 300 suicide planes. Now he would have his chance with something far worse. The Oka pilots were the elite of the elite. They had to be. Only the best pilots were selected because the Oka was incredibly difficult to control. It had no engine for most of the flight. It was just a heavy glider carrying a ton and 200 kilograms of explosives. The pilot had to glide for miles, estimating distances perfectly, waiting for the exact moment to activate the rockets. 1 second too early and he would run out of fuel before reaching the target. 1 second too late and he would be shot down before gaining speed. Training at Kanoik was brutal. Pilots flew training versions of the Oka equipped with ballast instead of explosives and a landing skid so they could land back at base. It was a wild 2-minute dive back to Earth. Several graduation flights ended in disaster, scattering metal, wood, and pieces of the pilot all over the airfield. On November 13, 1944, test pilot Lieutenant Kariya Tsutomu crashed and died during a launch test. On November 29th, another pilot was killed in the same way. These were just the deaths during training. Admiral Soema Toyota, Chief of the General Staff of the Navy, visited Kanoik in December to raise morale. He urged the Oka pilots to combat the enemy's material superiority with their spiritual strength. He presented each man with a white headband inscribed with the ideograms Jinrai Butai, and a short sword engraved with the recipient's name. Think about it for a moment. Japan's highest-ranking naval officer was giving personalized swords to 20-year-old boys, knowing they would be dead within weeks. In January 1945, before moving to their operational base in Kanoya in southern Kyushu, the pilots traveled to Tokyo to pray for success at Yasukuni Shrine, Meiji Shrine, and outside the Imperial Palace. Emperor Hirohito sent an aide-de-camp to Kanoik with his personal wishes for good luck. Imagine being one of those young pilots. You burned your old uniform and donned a new one. You cut locks of your hair and fingernails to place in unpainted wooden coffins for delivery to your parents. You know exactly when you will die. There is no uncertainty. There is no maybe. You will get into that small aircraft, be dropped from a bomber, and in a few minutes you will be dead. Guaranteed. A survivor described the Oka as his coffin. The cockpit was primitive and cramped. Once you got in, you were locked from the outside. There was no way out. Not even if the mother bomber was hit. Not even if you changed your mind. You were trapped there until launch. And then you were trapped in the final dive until impact. Some pilots kept diaries. A young man named Masaaki Seiki wrote down his reflections during training. His words reveal not blind fanaticism, but full awareness and resignation to fate. He knew what he was doing. He understood he was going to die. And yet he continued. The Oka's first operational mission was planned for March 21, 1945. The target was the American Task Force 58, which had launched heavy attacks against air bases in Kyushu. 16 Betty bombers carrying Okas took off from Kanoya. It was supposed to be the day that would change the course of the war. It wasn't. American fighters intercepted the formation long before they reached launch range. The Betty bombers, slow and heavy with the Okas hanging from their bellies, were perfect targets. All 16 bombers were shot down. 55 crewmen killed. 16 Oka pilots killed without ever having been launched. Not a single Oka even came close to an American ship. It was a complete massacre. But Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Naval Air Fleet, didn't give up. He would refine the tactics. He would wait for better conditions. He would use diversions. And on April 12th, it finally worked. That would be the date the USS Mannert L Abele became the first confirmed victim of the Oka and entered history. The Oka attacks continued throughout the Okinawa campaign. On May 4th, the destroyer USS Shi was hit by an Oka. It came so fast that the gunners had only 5 seconds between spotting the rocket and the impact. 5 seconds. There was no time to rotate the guns. There was no time to maneuver. The crew of the Shi described how the Oka simply materialized from the fog, traveling at over 1,000 kilometers per hour. The ship survived, but was severely damaged. On May 28th, another Oka attack. On June 22nd, the final mission. In total, of the 300 Okas available for the Okinawa campaign, 74 actually carried out operations. 56 were destroyed along with their mother aircraft or while making attacks. 7 American ships were damaged or sunk by Okas. Post-war analysis concluded that the impact of the Oka was negligible because no U.S. Navy capital ships were hit. American defensive tactics were effective. But to say the impact was negligible ignores the psychological terror the Oka caused. American sailors feared it more than any other Japanese weapon. It was the speed. You could see a conventional kamikaze coming, and you had a few seconds to try to shoot it down. With the Oka, you barely had time to realize you were under attack before impact. It was like being struck by lightning, unpredictable, inevitable, instantaneous. Survivors of the Abele described the Oka as something that appeared out of nowhere. One moment the sky was empty. The next moment, a catastrophic explosion. There was no warning. There was no reaction time. Just sudden and absolute death. For the Oka pilots who actually managed to complete missions, the last minutes of their lives were surreal. You were trapped inside a metal cylinder hanging from the belly of a Betty bomber. You fly for hours toward the target. Inside the dark, cramped bomb bay, connected to the rest of the crew only by red and green lights and basic communication. You wait. You're aboard. You breathe thin air. Then comes the signal. Launch. You drop. For a few seconds there is only gravity and silence as you glide. You see the American ships below. Hundreds of them. An entire fleet waiting for you. You adjust your course. You're planning perfectly, using every inch of range the wings can give you. You wait until you're close enough. And then you fire the rockets. Suddenly you are thrust back into your seat with crushing force. The acceleration is violent. The world blurs. You are going faster than any human being ever went in 1945. Faster than fighter jets. Faster than cannonballs. American anti-aircraft guns open fire, but you are too fast. The tracers lag behind. You aim for the ship. You can see the sailors on deck, small as ants, looking up, realizing too late what is coming. And then, white. For some Oka pilots, that moment never came. Hideo Suzuki was one of the Jinrai Butai pilots. He volunteered because he genuinely believed that massive attacks against American military targets would cause so much damage that the American public would protest and force an end to the war, saving lives on both sides. It seems insane now. But in the mind of a 20-year-old in 1945, educated in imperial propaganda, isolated from information about the true situation of the war, it seemed logical. It seemed heroic. Suzuki spent months watching his comrades leave, one after another. They all smiled as they boarded the plane, thinking they would soon meet at the Yasukuni Shrine. Their imminent deaths didn't seem like a sacrifice, but a chance to do something good for others. And then the war ended. Suzuki survived. And he felt deep shame for having survived while his friends died. He dedicated the rest of his life to honoring his comrades by living long and rebuilding Japan. That is the terrifying moral complexity of Oka. It wasn't monsters piloting those machines. It was idealistic, patriotic young men, courageous to the point of insanity, manipulated by a desperate military leadership that turned human beings into ammunition. Post-war Japan had to grapple with this horrific reality. How do you celebrate the courage of young men who sacrificed themselves for their country without glorifying the suicidal militarism that killed them? How do you honor the dead without validating the insanity that led to their deaths? The response was largely to forget. Monuments to Oka pilots exist in Kashima City, Kanoya City, and Kamakura, but they are discreet. There are no museums glorifying the Oka. There are no films celebrating the Jinrai Butai. The weapon itself is displayed in some museums around the world, including the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, but always within the context of desperate madness, not heroic innovation. 17 Okas were captured intact by the Americans in Okinawa on April 1, 1945, at Kita Airfield. 6 were sent to the United States for evaluation. They were later used in war bond sales campaigns. The discovery of the Okas completely surprised the Allies. American Air Technical Intelligence examined them on site, trying to understand what the hell the Japanese had created. The truth about the Oka is that it represented the lowest point of Japanese desperation. When you're building weapons that are guaranteed to kill your own pilots, you've already lost the war. You just haven't admitted it yet. The Japanese leadership knew this. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned Pearl Harbor, had predicted that Japan would have 6 months to a year of victories against the United States, after which American industrial superiority would crush them. He was right. In 1944, the United States produced 209 times more oil and 100 times more tanks than Japan. For every Japanese bullet fired, 524 American bullets responded. The war was lost. And yet, instead of negotiating peace, the Japanese leadership chose to prolong the agony with weapons like the Oka, and young men like those of the Jinrai Butai paid the price. Today, when we study the Oka, we're not just looking at a technical curiosity. We're looking into a dark mirror of human nature. What drives intelligent young men to voluntarily enter a flying machine with no way out? Patriotism? Propaganda? Social pressure? Desperation? Probably all of the above. The Oka forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about sacrifice, war, and the manipulation of youthful idealism. And that's precisely why both Japan and the United States preferred not to talk much about it after the war. For Americans, it was a reminder that the enemy was willing to go to unthinkable lengths. For the Japanese, it was a national shame. So, the secret weapon that destroyed the USS Mannert L Abele was quietly filed away in history. Not completely erased, but definitely minimized. Japanese textbooks rarely mention it. The American veterans who faced it died carrying memories that few understood. And the wreckage of the Abele rests on the seabed like a forgotten tomb of a forgotten weapon and the men who died because of it and inside it. 78 years later, in May 2023, when explorers finally found the Abele, something strange happened. Explorer Tim Taylor, whose father served in the Navy during the invasion of Okinawa and survived a kamikaze attack on the USS Telfire just days before the Abele was destroyed, said the discovery was deeply emotional for him. A connection across the decades. His father had been minutes away from suffering the same fate. And now, decades later, the son was finding the men who were not so lucky. But here's the detail few notice. When the U.S. Navy officially confirmed the wreck's identity, they declared it a legally protected war grave, sacred, untouchable. The 84 sailors are still there, preserved in the twisted steel. And somewhere in that wreckage field, buried in the mud 4,500 meters deep, are fragments of the Oka itself, the weapon and its victims forever united in the same dark tomb. Japan built 852 Okas. Only a few dozen were used in combat. The rest, nobody knows for sure. Some were captured, others destroyed when the war ended. But there are reports that thousands of suicide weapons, including okas, were hidden in caves and tunnels throughout Japan in preparation for the Allied invasion that never happened. Occasionally, explorers still find these sealed caves. They still find these weapons waiting for a mission that will never come, waiting for pilots who will never exist again. And perhaps that is the real reason why both Americans and Japanese quietly agreed not to talk much about the oka. It wasn't just shame or fear. It was because the weapon represented something that both sides recognized but didn't want to admit. That in war, the line between heroism and madness, between sacrifice and waste, between innovation and barbarity is much thinner than we would like to believe. And that sometimes the best way to deal with certain chapters of history is not to glorify or condemn them, but simply to let them rest at the bottom of the ocean where darkness and silence do the work that words never could. Some secrets, after all, are more powerful when they remain partially buried.